The late afternoon sun slanted through the dusty window of the piano studio, painting long, lazy rectangles across the scuffed wooden floor. Justus sat on his bench, the familiar, slightly sagging feel of it as routine as his own heartbeat. His hands rested on the keys of his old Steinway, but they weren't playing. They were simply resting, pale against the ivory. He was listening to the quiet hum of the building, the distant thump of a ballet class next door, the faint traffic from the street below. His eyes, as they often did these days, drifted to the wall. There, hanging slightly crooked, was the poster. The paper was yellowed at the edges. The colors faded from a deep blue to a weak sky. But the words were still clear. * Beethoven's Emperor Concerto, with the North German Philharmonic, featuring soloist Justus Friedrich Eichhorn, * 23 years. He could still remember the smell of the backstage area, that night rosin, nervous sweat, and the musty velvet of the curtain. He could remember the cool touch of the stage lights. And he could remember the crushing silence in the car with his wife afterward, a silence so heavy it felt like a third person sitting between them. The reviews had not been kind. They used words like competent and safe. One had written, a performance that spoke of many hours in a practice room, but perhaps not enough hours living. The memory was like a small, cold stone in his chest. He pushed it down, a movement as practiced as a scale. His life now was here, in this room. It was the gentle correction of a student's fingering, the repetitive plink-plonk of a child's first attempts at Ode to Joy, the soothing, rhythmic chords for the ballet dancers. It was a good life, useful, quiet. The sudden shrill ring of the telephone on his desk made him jump. No one called this line anymore except parents about schedules. He let it ring 3 times, then slowly got up, the bones in his knees giving a soft protest. Eichhorn, he said, his voice a little gravelly from disuse. Justus? It's me. The voice on the other end was warm, familiar, and brought with it a flood of older, freer memories. It was the conductor, an old friend from their wild conservatory days. They hadn't spoken in years, but the sound of his voice erased the time instantly. They exchanged brief, awkward pleasantries. How was his wife? His teaching? Justus gave short answers, his eyes drifting back to the faded poster. Then his friend's tone shifted, becoming serious, businesslike. Justus, I'm in a bind. Terrible bind. Klaus, who was to play the Beethoven first with us next week, he's slipped on ice. Broken wrist. The doctors say no playing for months. I'm sorry to hear that, Justus said, feeling a genuine pang of sympathy for the young pianist he'd never met. The thing is, Justus, the concert is in 10 days. The program is printed. The tickets are sold. It's the centerpiece. The conductor paused, and Justus could hear him breathing, could almost see him running a hand through his hair, the way he always did when stressed. I need someone who knows this music inside out. Someone who won't panic. I thought of you. Justus felt the floor tilt slightly. He leaned against the desk. Me? Don't be foolish. I haven't. I don't perform. Not like that. Who else? His friend insisted, his voice pleading now. You played it for our final exam. You played it better than any of us. It's in your bones, Justus. Please, just come to the first rehearsal tomorrow. See how it feels. For an old friend. The request hung in the air, fragile and immense. Justus looked around his studio at the stacks of sheet music, the metronome on the shelf, the comfortable, predictable dust dancing in the sunbeams. He looked at his hands. They were good hands, strong still, but they were the hands of a teacher. The skin was dry. A small, calloused spot on the 3rd finger of his right hand spoke of decades of contact with the key, not of recent, fiery practice. Just the rehearsal, the conductor said. A final gentle push. What was there to lose? He could go, play poorly, and his friend would see it was a mistake. They would find a bright young student from somewhere. He would come back to his studio, to his life, and the strange tremor in his stomach would settle. "All right," Justus heard himself say, the word sounding distant, like someone else had spoken it. "I'll come." But just the rehearsal. He hung up the phone. The silence in the room was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. He walked slowly back to the piano bench and sat down. The poster seemed to stare at him. Beethoven's First Concerto. It was a youthful work, full of cheek and charm and brilliant, sparkling energy. It required fingers that could fly, a spirit that could dance. He opened the fallboard and placed his hands on the keys in the position for the opening chords. He didn't press down. He just held them there, feeling the cool, smooth surface. In his mind, he heard the orchestra's introduction, the building tension before the piano's first bold, announcing statement. A statement that demanded confidence, demanded to be heard. A deep, cold doubt uncoiled in his stomach. It wasn't about forgetting the notes. The notes were there, etched in some deep part of his memory. It was about the man who had to play them. The man who had chosen a small, quiet life over the grand, terrifying one. Could that man stand before an orchestra and a hall full of people and make a statement? Or would he only make an apology? He finally pressed a key middle C. The note rang out, pure and simple in the quiet room. It was just a note. But to Justus, in that moment, it felt like the first step onto a very high, very unstable wire. He took his hand away and let the sound fade completely, swallowed by the familiar, safe silence of his studio. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow, he would step out into the noise. The concert hall was a cavern of shadows when Justus arrived, his footsteps echoing in the empty, velvet-lined space. He had come an hour early, needing to feel the piano alone, to claim the territory before anyone else arrived. The stage lights were off, only a single work light casting a lonely pool of gold on the grand piano at the center. It looked like a sleeping beast. His own piano at home was an old friend, with its familiar dents and the slightly sticky F-flat key. This instrument was a stranger polished to a mirror finish, sleek and imposing. He set his worn leather music satchel down, the sound too loud in the silence. He took off his coat, folded it neatly on a chair, and approached. He ran a hand over the lid, cool and smooth as ice dots sitting on the bench. He adjusted it, feeling the new height. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play, not the Beethoven, but a simple C major scale, listening to the room. The sound was bigger, brighter, harder to control. It flew out into the dark and came back to him as a faint, ghostly echo. He took a deep breath and began the concerto's first solo passage. The notes that were supposed to leap out with bold, commanding joy to his own ears. They sounded careful, polite, like a well-mannered guest entering a noisy party and softly clearing his throat. One by one, the musicians of the orchestra began to filter in, the noise level rising with the clatter of instrument cases, the warm-up bleats of clarinets and oboes, the deep thrum of a cello. They nodded at him with polite, professional curiosity. He saw the looks, the quick glance at his slightly old-fashioned suit, the assessment of the man who was a last-minute replacement. The conductor, his old friend, bounded up to the podium with a wide smile, clapping his hands. "All right, everyone. Let's welcome our soloist. An old friend and a wonderful musician. We'll start from the top. Let's get a feel for it." The orchestra tuned, a wonderful, chaotic chord that resolved into silence. The conductor raised his baton, and with a sharp downbeat, the music began. The sound was a physical force, a wave of energy that poured over Justus. It was thrilling and terrifying. He counted the measures, his heart pounding in his throat, waiting for his entrance. And then it was there. His fingers moved, accurate and clean. Every note was in its right place. But as he played, he felt a wall between himself and the sea of musicians around him. He was playing next to them, not with them. In a particularly spirited section, he rushed, just slightly, and the concertmaster, the first violinist, shot a sharp look at the conductor, a tiny frown of correction, the rehearsal ground on. At the end of the first movement, the conductor lowered his arms. The music stopped, but the air buzzed with a kind of awkwardness. "Good, good," the conductor said, but his voice lacked its usual fire. "Let's take it from the cadenza, Justus. Give us a bit more. Shape there." The cadenza was the soloist's moment to shine, to improvise and show off. Beethoven had written one, but it was still a personal statement. Justus played it perfectly, and it sounded like a difficult etude, a technical exercise. When he finished, the orchestra's re-entry felt like a relief, a return to the safety of the written score. After the rehearsal ended, the silence was heavy. The musicians packed up quickly, the chatter subdued. The conductor came over, his podium smile gone. "My office. For a coffee." They sat in the small, cluttered room, the 2 cups of coffee steaming between them. His old friend didn't mince words. He stirred his coffee slowly, the spoon clinking against the china. "Justus," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "you are playing all the notes Beethoven wrote. Every single one. They are clean, they are correct." Justus looked into his coffee, feeling a hot prickle of shame on his neck. He knew what was coming. But the conductor continued, "I am not hearing Beethoven. I am hearing a very good pianist being very careful." He leaned forward. "Where is the argument? This music, especially the first movement, it's a debate. The orchestra states an idea, and you, the piano, you answer. You disagree. You shout sometimes. Then you find a way to dance together. What I heard today was a polite nod, a quiet agreement to avoid a fight." He put his hand on the score, tapping it. "This isn't just music from the page. It's music from here." He touched his own chest. "And from a life. Where is your life in this, Justus? Where is the frustration, the joy, the anger? You have 10 days. You need to find it." He walked out of the hall into the gray afternoon. The conductor's words rang in his ears, louder than the orchestra had been. Polite, careful, they were the same words, the same damning judgment from 23 years ago. It was as if he had stepped into a trap he himself had built long ago at home. He didn't go to the piano. He couldn't. He sat in his armchair in the darkening living room, the failure soaking into him. His wife, sensing his mood, simply placed a hand on his shoulder for a moment before going to the kitchen. The gentle understanding in that touch was worse than any criticism. He was a teacher. He taught students to play the right notes, with the right fingering, at the right time. That was his job. That was who he was. The grand passion, the raw feeling his friend demanded, that belonged to younger men, to artists with something to prove. He had nothing to prove anymore. He had a quiet life, and he had just confirmed it was too late to make it loud. He thought about calling the conductor, telling him it was a mistake, that they should find someone else. A bright, fearless student who wouldn't fear the argument in the music. Before he could move, his eye caught an old, cardboard box on the top shelf of his bookcase, partly hidden by books. He hadn't opened it in decades. With a sense of dread and a strange pull, he got up, dragged a chair over, and brought it down. Dust flew in the lamplight. He lifted the lid. Inside were relics of another life. Programs, tickets, and on top, a simple black-covered notebook. his conservatory journal. He opened it. The handwriting was his own, but it leaped off the page sharp, energetic, filled with exclamation points and underlines. On one page, next to notes about the Beethoven first, he had written in bold, youthful script, asterisk, the piano entrance must be a revelation, not just a continuation. It is the individual voice announcing itself to the world. It says, I am here. Now listen. Asterisk, he stared at the words. I am here, the young man who wrote that believed it utterly. He felt a sudden, piercing grief, not for a lost career, but for that young man's unshakable belief. That young man was gone. What was left was a careful, polite stranger living in his house, playing his piano. He closed the journal. The gap between that passionate student and the man who had sat on the stage today felt like a canyon, deep and dark and impossible to cross. He put the box back on the shelf. The thought of the rehearsal tomorrow, of facing those patient, professional faces again, made him feel sick. The performance was in 10 days, and for the first time, he truly believed he could not do it. The morning after the disastrous rehearsal, Justus did something he hadn't done in 30 years. He didn't go to the piano. The silence in his studio, usually a comfort, now felt like an accusation. The sheet music for the concerto sat open on the stand, a maze of black dots and lines that seemed to whisper of his failure. He canceled his students for the day with a brief, apologetic phone call. His wife had already left for her work at the library, and the apartment was empty and still. He paced from the living room to the kitchen, the old floorboards creaking under his feet. The conductor's words were a loop in his mind. Asterisk, find the argument. Find your life in it. Asterisk, but how did you find something you had deliberately put away? His life was here, in these rooms. It was in the schedule on the fridge, the quiet meals, the familiar worn spot on his armchair. Where was the argument in that? Driven by a restless, unhappy energy, he put on his coat and went outside. He didn't have a destination. He just walked, away from the music school, away from the concert hall, into the everyday parts of the city. He walked past the busy market, where vendors shouted about the price of apples, and the smell of fresh bread and overripe fish mixed in the cold air. He saw a man and a woman arguing passionately over a basket of tomatoes, their voices loud, their hands waving. It wasn't a polite disagreement. It was full of real feeling. He kept walking. He passed a playground where children screamed with laughter, the sound raw and unchecked. He saw an old man on a bench, feeding pigeons, his face a map of deep, silent lines. He walked until his feet hurt, until the chill air bit his ears. On his way back to his apartment building, he ran into his neighbor from downstairs. The man was angry, his face red. Eichhorn, finally! Your mail was put in my box again. This is the 3rd time. Can you not check your number? It was a small thing, a tiny daily frustration. But the neighbor's irritation was real, immediate, and filling the space between them. Justus, who would normally just apologize quietly and take the letters, felt a sudden spark. And you could simply put it back in the hall for me, instead of letting it sit for days, he heard himself say, his own voice sharper than he'd intended. The neighbor blinked, surprised. They stood for a moment in a standoff of genuine human annoyance. Then the neighbor huffed and thrust the envelopes at him. Justus took them, and the man stalked away. The interaction left Justus's heart beating a little faster. It was a tiny, stupid argument, but it was real. It had weight back inside. The silence of his apartment felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of the echoes of the market, the children's shouts, the neighbor's red face. He didn't go to the studio. He made a pot of tea and sat at the kitchen table, looking at nothing. The next day, he did the same thing. He walked. He listened. He let himself feel the minor frustrations of a crowded bus, the small joy of finding a cafe that made coffee just right. He avoided the piano completely. It was a strange kind of torture, this self-imposed silence. His fingers itched to play, but his mind was afraid. He was breaking a habit of a lifetime, and it left him feeling unsteady, like he was forgetting who he was. On the third morning, something in him shifted. It wasn't a decision, more like an instinct. He went into his studio in his socks, the floor cool. He didn't open the score. He didn't even sit on the bench at first. He stood by the piano and placed a single finger on middle C. He pressed it, not thinking about tone or technique. He just let the note happen. Then he did something he never allowed his students to do. He closed his eyes and let his hands fall on the keyboard in a loud, crashing cluster of sound. It was ugly. It was noise. It was an argument with the instrument itself. He held the discordant sound, let it vibrate in the small room, and then released. He sat down. He didn't think about Beethoven. He thought about the red-faced neighbor. With a stiff, angry motion, he played a series of short, loud, punching chords in his left hand. Thump, 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 like a beating heart, or a fist on a door. He thought about the conductor's patient, disappointed face. With his right hand, he played a rapid, swirling line of notes that tried to climb away from the angry chords, a line of protest and confusion. He let the two hands fight. It wasn't music. It was chaos. But it was felt. He stopped, breathing heavily. The room settled. Then, from that chaos, a simple, clear melody emerged from his right hand, something sweet and sad and lonely. It was the melody of his own quiet life, of the silent apartment and the dusty studio. He played it simply, and it sounded, for the first time, true. Only then did he let Beethoven back in. He didn't start at the beginning. He went straight to the cadenza, that solo passage that had sounded so empty. This time, he didn't play the notes as written on the page. He played the feeling. He played the frustration of the walk, the shock of the argument, the weight of the years. He played the angry chords and the sweet, sad melody he had just found, weaving them into Beethoven's own notes. The technical passages became bursts of energy, not displays of skill. The pauses became moments of thought, not just rests. He played it through once, and it was messy. He missed a few notes. The timing was rough, but it was alive. It had a pulse. He stood up, his legs shaky. He needed to do something physical to match the energy that was now moving in him. He looked at the piano, this old friend that had been a place of hiding. Almost without thinking, he brought his hand down in one final, solid fist of sound on the lower keys aloud. Rude, glorious bang. The sound echoed, and then there was a sharp ping, followed by a dying, wobbly hum. He looked down. The lowest, a string had snapped, coiling back on itself, like a broken spring. He stared at it. A broken string was a teacher's nightmare. It was a hassle, an expense, a sign of neglect or abuse, but Justus didn't feel dread. A slow, real smile spread across his face, the first in days. He reached out and gently touched the broken wire. It wasn't a setback. It felt like a release, like something tight and held for too long had finally given way. The piano had argued back, and it had lost a tooth in the fight. He would have to call the tuner. But not today. Today, the broken string was perfect. It was proof. He had finally started to play. The day of the final dress rehearsal arrived, and the feeling in Justus's stomach was entirely new. It wasn't the cold dread of before, but a live, fluttering energy, like a bird trapped under his ribs. The broken piano string had been fixed, the tuner muttering about unusual wear. Justus had just nodded. the secret smile still playing on his lips. He arrived at the concert hall, not early to hide, but early to settle. The stage was buzzing with the orchestra already in their places, the air thick with the scent of resin and the warm-up cacophony of 100 instruments. He walked to the piano, his steps firm on the wooden stage. He nodded to the concertmaster, who gave a curt, professional nod in return. The conductor was at the podium, flipping through his score. He glanced up as Justus approached. "Feeling better?" he asked, his voice neutral, but his eyes were searching. "Different," Justus said, and that was all. He sat at the piano, adjusted the bench one last time, and placed his hands in his lap. He didn't play a note to warm up. He just listened. He listened to the orchestra's chaotic sounds coalescing into the unified note of the tuning A. He listened to the rustle of pages, the clearing of throats. He let the energy of the room wash over him. Instead of shrinking from it, the conductor raised his hands. "All right, everyone. From the top, let's make it sing." The opening chords from the orchestra were bright, crisp, and full of expectation. Justus counted the bars, his breathing steady. His entrance was no longer a timid step into the light. It was a statement. The notes were the same, but the sound was fuller, rounder, and perfectly timed. It didn't just speak. It announced. He saw the conductor's eyebrows lift slightly, almost imperceptibly as the movement unfolded. Something began to happen. Justus wasn't just playing his part. He was listening, truly listening to the oboist's sweet, mournful line. When it was his turn to answer, his phrasing was a conversation, a gentle agreement. Then, in the playful back and forth with the violins, he added a tiny, almost mischievous hesitation, making the musical question sparkle. The violins, startled and delighted, answered with a little more bounce. He was not just a soloist in front of a machine. He was a man in a room full of other musicians. He caught the eye of the timpanist during a rhythmic passage and gave a tiny, acknowledging nod just before a tricky joint entrance. The timpanist, a serious man with a bushy mustache, gave a barely there wink back, and their next entry was perfectly locked together, a moment of shared, unspoken understanding. The music began to breathe as one creature. When they reached the cadenza, the space where Justus had once felt so exposed, he leaned into it. He played with a raw, personal storytelling. There was struggle in it, a few rough, stormy passages that spoke of his long walk and his frustrations. But then it cleared, finding a melody of such simple, honest tenderness that the hall seemed to grow quieter, the musicians themselves listening. He wasn't showing off. He was letting them in. When the orchestra crashed back in for the final triumphant section, the sound was huge, joyful, and unified. The last chord rang out, and for a second there was a beautiful, vibrant silence, the kind that only follows music that has truly been lived in. The conductor lowered his baton slowly. He didn't say good or better. He just looked at Justus, his stern conductor's face softening into something genuine and warm. He gave a single, slow nod. It was a nod of respect, from one musician to another. No words were needed. The ice was broken. As they moved through the lyrical second movement, the musicians leaned in. You could see it in their posture. They were playing with him, supporting the long singing lines of the piano with a bed of sound that felt like held breath. In the final rollicking rondo, the energy was infectious. Justus played with a lightness, a humor he'd forgotten he possessed, and the orchestra matched him, bounce for bounce. A flutist smiled behind her instrument. The cellists swayed slightly in unison. When the final note of the rehearsal faded, the usual immediate rustle of packing up didn't happen. There was a moment of stillness. Then, a few of the musicians, starting with the timpanist and the high, principal oboist, tapped their stands lightly with a bow or a drumstick. It wasn't the roaring applause of an audience. It was something rarer and more meaningful in the world of an orchestra. Professional approval. Acknowledgement from the group. Justus felt a surge of emotion so powerful it tightened his throat. He stood and gave a small, humble bow to the orchestra. They nodded back. The connection was made. Later, in the conductor's office, the mood was entirely different. His old friend was beaming, pouring 2 small glasses of sherry. Now that, he said, handing a glass to Justus, was Beethoven. That was music. You found it. Justus took the glass, the sweet smell hitting his nose. I think, he said slowly, it found me. He walked home through the twilight, the city lights coming on like distant stars. The nervous energy had transformed into a deep, steady hum of readiness. He wasn't thinking about the audience that would be there tomorrow night. He was thinking about the community of musicians on that stage out at home. He went to his bedroom closet. From the very back, he brought out a garment bag, its plastic yellowed with age. He unzipped it. Inside was his old concert tuxedo. His mother had bought it for him for his graduation recital, a lifetime ago. The wool was a little heavy, the style slightly outdated compared to the sleek modern ones. He took it out and laid it on the bed. He found his white dress shirt, still crisp in its packaging from the last time it had been laundered years ago. His bow tie, a simple black one. He polished his shoes slowly, methodically, until they shone faintly in the lamplight. Looking at the clothes laid out, he didn't see a costume for a role he had to pretend to fill. He saw the uniform of the man he was finally becoming again, but older, wiser, and more real. The young man who first wore this suit had passion, but it was a flame that could be blown out by a harsh review. The man who would wear it tomorrow had found a different kind of fire, one that had been banked under the ashes of quiet years, and was now burning with a steady, enduring heat. He wasn't haunted by the ghost of his younger self anymore. That young man was not a rival or a failure. He was just the first chapter. The man here now, in this quiet room, had lived the chapters in between. He had taught, he had listened, he had walked the city, he had argued with a neighbor. He had broken a string, and now he was ready, not to prove anything to the world, but simply to offer it the music and the life he now understood. The night of the concert arrived, and the air outside the concert hall was electric with the murmur of the crowd and the flash of cameras. Justus stood in the quiet, dimly lit preparation room, a small space that smelled of old wood and floor polish. He could hear the distant, muffled sounds of the audience finding their seats, a low rumble of anticipation. He adjusted his cuffs, the fabric of his old tuxedo familiar against his wrists. A stagehand, a young woman with a headset, gave him a gentle thumbs up. 5 minutes, sir. Justus nodded. He wasn't thinking about the thousands of people out there. He was thinking about the walk from the wings to the piano. He was thinking about the first touch of the keys. He breathed in slowly, feeling the calm, solid ground of readiness beneath him. He was not a young man about to conquer the world. He was a man about to share something true. The door opened, and the conductor peeked in. He was in his tailcoat, his face alive with the pre-concert energy. He didn't say anything about the music or wish him luck. He just met Justus's eyes and smiled, a real warm smile. Then he was gone. The sound of the orchestra tuning filtered through the wall, that wonderful, chaotic chord that always made Justus's heart lift. Then it stopped. Silence. The audience was ready. The stagehand whispered, "Now, sir." Justus walked out of the dimness and into the brilliant light of the stage. The applause was a wave of warm sound that hit him. He saw a sea of faces, a blur of darkness and expectation. He kept his eyes forward, walking with a steady pace to the piano at the center of everything. He acknowledged the audience with a brief, modest bow, then turned to the orchestra. He gave a small nod to the concertmaster, and then to the conductor, who was already on the podium. This wasn't a soloist's grand entrance. It was a colleague joining his team. He sat. He settled on the bench, took a moment to feel its position, and placed his hands on his knees. He looked at the piano, its lid raised like a great black wing. He was not afraid of it. It was just his instrument. The conductor raised his arms, and the hall held its breath. The orchestra began. The opening was bright, joyful, and precise. Justus listened, his body still, counting the measures not with anxiety, but with a deep, attentive focus. The music built, tension rising like a drawn bowstring. And then his moment arrived. His hands moved from his knees to the keyboard. The first notes of the piano's entrance rang out clean, clear, and filled with a confident, singing tone. It was not a shout, but a firm, undeniable declaration. Here I am. It was the voice of a man who had nothing left to prove, only something to say. He felt the orchestra wrap around his sound, not overwhelming it, but supporting it, answering it. The musical argument his friend had demanded was alive, a spirited, respectful, and thrilling debate between old friends Dot as the first movement danced between power and playfulness. Justus lost all sense of the crowd. He was in a world of sound. He traded smiles with the flutist during a light, skipping passage. He locked eyes with the conductor in a moment of fierce shared rhythm, and they moved together as one. The cadenza was no longer a trial. It was a story. He poured into it the quiet of his studio, the frustration of his walks, the peace he had found. It was thoughtful, stormy, and ultimately peaceful. When the orchestra rejoined him, the feeling was one of glorious reunion. The second movement, the slow one, was where something unexpected happened. The music here was deeply lyrical, a long, tender song. As Justus played the gentle, falling melody, he wasn't thinking of technique. He was thinking of his wife's hand on his shoulder in a moment of quiet understanding. He was thinking of the faces of his students when they finally grasped a difficult phrase. He was thinking of the simple, good things that had filled the years between then and now. The music became a thank you note to a quiet life, and it was so full of honest emotion that many in the audience stopped breathing for a moment. A few of the musicians behind him played with their eyes closed, lost in the beauty they were helping to create. Then, without pause, the finale burst forth, a rush of pure, unchecked joy. Justus played it with a lightness he didn't know he still had. His fingers flew, not with the stiff precision of practice, but with the abandon of a dance. The orchestra raced alongside him, every section crisp and bright, caught up in the same irresistible spirit. It was fast, it was clear, and it was fun. The final chords were played with unanimous, powerful delight, ringing through the hall. For a second, there was absolute silence. A perfect, stunned silence. Then the applause erupted. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a roar, a physical wave of sound that seemed to shake the very lights. Justus, breathing heavily, stood up. The noise was overwhelming. He bowed to the audience, then turned and gestured deeply to the orchestra, sharing the credit. He shook the conductor's hand firmly, and the conductor pulled him into a quick, hard embrace, clapping him on the back. The applause went on and on. Justus bowed again, his vision slightly blurred. He looked out, not at the faceless crowd, but at the front rows. And there he saw them. His wife, her face glowing with pride, tears shining on her cheeks. And next to her, a small group of his students, their faces alight with amazement. They weren't just seeing a teacher. They were seeing the music he had always told them about, made real. One of them, the shy girl who struggled with her confidence, was clapping so hard her hands must have hurt Dot in that moment. Justus Friedrich Eichhorn understood. This was not a comeback. This was not a victory over the past. It was a completion. The young man from the poster had the passion, but he lacked the life to fuel it. The man who had just played had lived that life with all its quietness, its disappointments, its simple joys. He had needed every bit of it to understand the full story the music was trying to tell. The applause washed over him, warm and sustaining. He took one last bow, a deep one, from the waist. He was not just thanking the audience. He was thanking the journey. He walked off the stage, the noise still thundering behind him, and the first thing he felt was not exhaustion, but a profound and quiet gratitude. The music, and the life lived to finally understand it, had been worth the wait. He smiled, a real, easy smile, and went to find his wife.